Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Wolfgang Hiller, and I'm the Director for Impact Assessment and Foresight in the European Parliamentary Research Service. I welcome all of you online to this policy roundtable called EU-Ukraine 2035 Foresight Beyond the War. I welcome in particular Mr. Michael GAHLER, Member of the European Parliament and Rapporteur on Ukraine for the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Today, we will present and discuss the report EU-Ukraine 2035, which is the final result of the strategic foresight conversation on the future of the EU and Ukraine that took place between June 2022 and June 2023. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24 February 2022, it was immediately clear that this war would affect geopolitics and geoeconomics for a long time to come. Parliament's research service therefore decided to start an expert consultation on the possible long-term impact of the invasion and make the effort, which was not obvious at that time, to also look at consequences beyond the war. Let me just share a few slides to explain this process. Policy foresight is a collective effort of experts to imagine possible futures that could happen in 10 or more years from now, and then reflect these images back to the present in order to make better policy decisions today. First of all, who were our experts? As you can see, most of them came from universities and think tanks in order to guarantee free and independent thinking about the future. The second largest group consisted of EU officials from Parliament, Commission and Council to make sure that future visions would not be disconnected from existing EU policies. A small number of experts came from business, NGOs or international organizations. Most of our experts were nationals of EU countries, but we also had experts from Ukraine to include their perspective. None of the experts is mentioned by name in the report. This is a deliberate choice because foresight can best be done in an atmosphere of trust where people feel safe to express themselves without being held accountable for their words. The process consisted of 3 phases. First came the expert consultations, done in the form of written service, online interviews and in-person workshops. Then, during the winter of 22 to 23, 4 scenarios were drafted for possible futures of the EU and Ukraine, which were discussed with the experts. In a third and final step, policy considerations were drawn, looking back from these scenarios to the present, asking what could be done to bring about or avoid certain scenarios. Let me now turn to the content of the report. First the scenarios and then the policy considerations. A good scenario exercise includes desirable and less desirable futures. You can see here the grid with the summary of all 4 scenarios. I know that the text is too small to be read on screen. You can read them in the report, which is available online. Let me just indicate the main direction of each scenario. Only one scenario is optimal for both the EU and Ukraine. It's called fair stability and presented on a green background. In this scenario, Ukraine will win back all its territory and becomes a member of EU and NATO, while Russia will accept its defeat. The opposite scenario on a red background is called devastated Europe. In this case, Russia will not accept defeat but escalate the war, leading to NATO involvement but no EU accession for Ukraine. And then there are 2 scenarios in which the front gets stuck. This can happen without any agreement in a second Cold War, or based on negotiations and provisional arrangements leading to a frozen conflict. Although these scenarios may be somewhat sobering, the most important part of the exercise is to draw policy considerations from them. What could the EU and Ukraine do to steer the process in a desirable direction. One of the added values of this report is that it shows the interlinkages between those policy considerations. It shows that many elements need to be considered at the same time. The report sums them up as 4 areas of action. First, yes, this is the right slide. First, the need to move from military support to Ukraine towards thinking about the new European security architecture. Second, to combine these steps towards EU enlargement with planning for the reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine. Third, the need to imagine an enlarged EU and consider all actions to make it effective, sustainable, and sovereign in a geopolitical world. And fourth, to start thinking in a long-term perspective about the EU's relations with key countries to the conflict, in particular Russia and Belarus, but also Turkey, China, and the US. Now let me conclude. The EU-Ukraine 2035 project is an example of what we call anticipatory governance. This means that we try to improve the quality of our governance by applying foresight techniques. This can support our politicians, the members of our parliament, in taking the right decisions for the future. And with those words, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. GAHLER, Rapporteur on Ukraine, for some keynote remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, GAHLER, for these introductions, and thank you for having me in this meeting. I would like, first of all, to thank the project team for doing all the work to have these conversations and to draft this report. I think it's very important that we look at the future and the long-term implications of this dreadful war. This kind of work complements the day-to-day actions that we as politicians have to undertake in steering the rough waters of our time. And they will stay rough, will not calm down soon, I'm afraid. I would like to emphasize that the European Parliament has been very committed and involved in dealing with everything that has happened in Ukraine in the last 2 decades, not only from the start of this full-scale war, but already in 2004 and in 2014, when the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity took place. Ever since, there have been contacts with the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, in the meanwhile, almost on a daily basis in different setups. Since the start of the Russian full-scale aggression, the European Parliament has been particularly active in passing resolutions to call upon the Commission and Member States to undertake action. As the report mentions, between February 22 and February 23 alone, Parliament had passed no less than 24 resolutions related to Ukraine. Already on the 1st of March 22, just days after the invasion, we condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms, called for sanctions against Russia and for comprehensive support to Ukraine. Resolutions followed the course of events, addressing also the indirect consequences of the war, such as Ukrainian refugees coming to EU countries or the energy crisis. Parliament has in particular spurred member states to deliver enough weapons to Ukraine to defend itself. That this often took more time than expected showed the deficits of our European defense system. Without denying the importance of NATO and most and foremost, of course, the United States, it is obvious that EU countries have to do more, much more, to boost their own defense capacities and further develop a coherent European defense industry. The European Commission has made several proposals in this respect, and we have supported these from the side of the Parliament. We passed already ASAP, the Act in Support of Ammunition Production, and EDIRPA, the European Defence Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act. Thinking about a European pillar in NATO needs to become more concrete and I'm pleased to see that the experts have spent thoughts on this. But I think time has also come in to look ahead to the future and beyond the sorrows of today. The recommendation of the European Commission to open accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, which the European Council, well, is hopefully and I think likely to follow at its meeting mid-December, opens up completely new perspective and dynamic. Enlargement is going to be one of the most important topics for the next 10 years, that is the next 2 parliamentary mandates. It is therefore important that we think about how to prepare for enlargement, not only in Ukraine or other candidate countries, but also in the current EU. It is good that the report contributes to this thinking. For Ukraine, enlargement will be linked to reform and reconstruction. It is clear that Ukraine must apply the rule of law and combat corruption. They know it, and we know it, and the citizens in Ukraine expect it. And all actions taken by the government so far are a hopeful sign that they take this serious. Reconstruction needs a lot of money. The Commission has proposed the Ukraine facility, which will deliver 50 billion euro to Ukraine up to the end of 2027. I'm very happy that the European Parliament has just weeks ago supported this plan with a very broad majority, not only in the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Budget Committee, but in the meanwhile, we also voted overwhelmingly 514 to 43 votes in the last plenary in Strasbourg. I therefore welcome that the experts have also looked into the process of reconstruction and the conditions to make it successful. Finally, I'm aware that many difficulties lie ahead of us. Enlargement will not only ask much from Ukraine, but it will also ask for flexibility from us, the existing European Union member states. The problems with grain exports from Ukraine through Poland and other countries have shown that sensitive interests of our own farmers are at stake. Farmers who already have a difficult time in succeeding business without enlargement. But let us be clear, such problems can be overcome. The European Union has been able to absorb the big enlargement of 2004 and a bit in 2007. So why wouldn't we be able to absorb other enlargements some 30 years later? The EU will also have to reform itself in terms of decision-making, but also in terms of certain policies. This is the agenda for the coming decade. And again, it is good that the report points at this. Ladies and gentlemen, these are my main considerations, but I don't want to take up more time now. Let us listen to the experts and see what they have to say. I once again thank them for their work and pass the floor now to Mario Dahmen, project leader of this Foresight exercise, to take over and moderate the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. GAHLER, for these kind words, and thank you very much, Wolfgang, for your introductory words. So my name is indeed Mario Dahmen. I was the project leader and the main author of the report. I would like to emphasize that this report is the fruit of a collective exercise. So not only we had 62 experts involved, but also many colleagues worked on this. And at this occasion, I would like to thank in particular Antoine Cahen, Lieve van Woensel and Virginia Mahieu for their work on this project. I'm very happy to see that we have 114 people online. So a practical remark, household remark. If you have any questions coming up during the panel discussion or later, please type them into the chat. So we will then read the chat and Virginia will collect all your questions and I will then relay them to the panelists after the panel discussion. I would like to say that the panel we are going to do will be in the same style as the project itself, namely as a kind of conversation. So of the 62 panelists, of course, we couldn't have them all, so we have 4 of them here, and I'm very happy to welcome them here. and I will relay 2 questions to each panelist to open, and after that there will be time for the audience to join in the debate. Now, maybe we can just once more share one slide, Cecile, of the 4 scenarios. There they are. So I would like to emphasize once more that scenarios are not predictions, but they are an outlook to possible futures. And not of them, all of them are positive, but we have to look at all options that could happen. And when we have this conversation now, we will follow more or less the structure of the report. That is to say, we will start to talk about the war and what is then coming from that in terms of a potential European security architecture. Then next, we will look at questions about enlargement of the EU and also the consequences that it means for the EU. If you start to enlarge, what can the EU itself do to better prepare for such an enlargement? And finally, we will talk about Ukraine itself, the future of Ukraine, including the question of recovery and reconstruction. Now, having said that, I would like to open the debate with the experts, and I turn to the first expert, which is Ms. Ruth Dermond. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this fascinating event.
Yes, thank you, Ruth, for being with us. So Ruth is a senior lecturer in post-Soviet security at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Now, Ruth, let me start on the topic of your expertise, and that is Russia, the country that started the war. So when we discussed these questions with the experts, there seemed to be quite a lot of consensus on how Russia could react in case of a Cold War II scenario or in case of a frozen conflict scenario, and how its regime or a successor regime could then stabilize its position. But the experts were less clear about what could happen when Russia would be defeated militarily. On the one hand, there was the option that Russia would accept this defeat, and then we come into a scenario in the style of the fair stability scenario, where Russia accepts not only the loss of the annexed territories, but where it also would accept paying reparations for damage done, and even for putting their people on trial for war crimes. But it could also happen the other way around, that Russia would not accept such a defeat, and as a reaction to that would then start to escalate the war with all its consequences. Now, complex questions. You, Ruth, what do you think about these, and what reflections can you share with us?
Well, I think the first thing to say is a caveat, really, which is that the other things that we're discussing today and that are discussed in the report are issues for which we have a roadmap, for which there are precedents, enlargement, financial assistance, engagement with third-party states. But this is uncharted territory. We have never been in a situation in which a nuclear superpower launches a war of conquest against a neighbouring European state. And so any of the outcomes are perhaps more speculative than in other areas. So that would be a kind of caveat to what I'm going to say. I think in terms of the scenarios that we've talked about, it seems to me unlikely that we would see a defeated Russia turning to any kind of significant military escalation against European states in the EU or in NATO, for 2 reasons, really. Because conventional capabilities would be, I think, so degraded at that point that it would become extremely difficult, indeed impossible, in my view, for Russia, having reached a point where defeat in Ukraine had occurred, to then engage in any kind of conventional military action against any other states in the near or medium term. That then raises the question of whether nuclear escalation might be a possibility. And clearly one has to be enormously careful when one talks about this because of the terrible risks that are involved. But it seems to me that this is also a very unlikely scenario, and really for two reasons. Firstly, because any nuclear use by Russia obviously evidently poses an direct existential threat to Russia itself, to its political elites, and to the loved ones, the family members of those elites, which acts as a very significant constraint because of likely retaliation. And the second is a more kind of pragmatic consideration, if that's the right word, which is that we, as far as we can see, there is very significant kind of constraint being imposed by China, a state on which Russia now depends enormously for political, diplomatic, economic support as it's been weakened by the war. So I think, the worst case scenarios that are envisaged here, it seems to me, are unlikely to come to pass in terms of kind of conflict. One of the other things that we've talked about is the possibility of a collapse of the Russian state. And it seems to me that we would be unlikely in any of the scenarios to see anything like a Soviet-style disintegration of the kind that we saw in 1991. And I think I would identify two reasons why that, it seems to me, is a very unlikely scenario. The Soviet system had constituent republics that had many of the structures, at least on paper, of independent states. They had legislatures, they had governments, they had constitutions, they had political frameworks, and clearly these provided a kind of basis for which the republics of the Soviet Union could separate when the Soviet Union collapsed. They also, by that stage, had kind of independent political groupings inside the constituent republics. None of that applies in the case of Russia. Putin has spent 25 years almost consolidating power in the center and crushing political opponents, potential political challenges. And so the kind of building blocks that would facilitate a kind of Russian disintegration, it seems to me, are not there. What is possible, I think, and one thing that the European Union will need to engage with is the possibility that Russia kind of turns into something like a failed state in a collapse scenario. The other thing I wanted to say very quickly, I think, is that whichever of these possible scenarios is the end point or closest to the end point, there needs to be a kind of engagement in the European Union and in other Western institutions with how, with the problems of engaging with Russia in the future, because as long as there is anything like the current Russian government with a current attitude towards the West, any kind of government that sees the West as the principal enemy, as hostile to Russia, it's going to make any kind of arrangements, any agreements, any treaties extremely difficult. The Russian government, I don't think, can be relied on to adhere to any peace agreements or treaties that emerge out of the end of the war, because they would not, it seems to me, regard it as in their national interest to do so, both because the West is seen as hostile, as a threat, and also because it's a matter that touches on their areas of core strategic interest. So I'll stop there. That's a lot of material to cover.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Very interesting thoughts. So on the one hand, a reassuring message that you don't think that escalation is very likely. On the other hand, a little bit worrying message that in case we come to agreements with Russia, they might not stick to them or not implement them in the way we would consider correct. And maybe that brings us then to another aspect that was discussed in this strategic project, and that is the future security architecture of Europe. So even with a collapsed Russia or a different Russia, we still would have to protect ourselves. And this begs the question about the future security architecture and the roles of NATO and the EU in it. Now, you remember that most of our experts thought that NATO would be in almost any security architecture we can imagine a crucial pillar, the main element. And when we look at Sweden and Finland joining NATO, then this is also very likely. Only in the frozen conflict scenario, this was not the case. But there was less consensus about this role for the European Union. We know that member states are investing a lot in defense now. We know that the European Commission has come up with several proposals, and Mr. GAHLER has mentioned some of them, and is working hard also to create a European defense industrial base. But there could also be pushback against such plans. There are also member states who prefer to do everything in NATO, and I'm thinking of Poland, for instance. And there could also be pushback from other NATO members not being in the European Union, like the UK or the US, who might not really like the idea of the EU building really a strong European pillar inside NATO, even if it's inside NATO. So how do you see these developments, and could you reflect with us on that?
Yes. Again, this is a slightly difficult question to talk about, because there are several, as the former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld would say, several known unknowns. There are several key variables that are likely to affect how this progresses in the near and medium term. I mean, I think one thing that the war has unquestionably shown is the need for greater coordination between key European institutions, particularly the European Union and NATO, and obviously that is something recognised by both NATO and the European Union. It's obvious, I think, another lesson from the war, it's obvious that one of the things that has to happen is a strengthening of the European defence industrial base, and that, it seems to me, is an area where NATO is and the European Union are likely to be able to cooperate very fruitfully, or engage with each other very fruitfully. There's obviously the issue of strategic autonomy. I will leave that perhaps to others who will want to come in on that. I think that any kind of reluctance to see a kind of greater European Union kind of role in this area in relation to NATO or working with NATO, I think that's going to be less of an issue in future, perhaps, simply because there is this recognition that there needs to be more joined up thinking, engagement on defence questions, given the scale and the nature of the threat that we're currently facing. Of course, the great, as I say, known unknown is the effect of the next US presidential election. And it seems to me that this is going to be hugely significant, both for NATO and therefore for NATO-EU interaction, cooperation on this issue as on everything else, because to a degree that we have never seen before, I think the future of NATO is being challenged by the likely or possible outcome of the next US presidential election. We know that were former President Trump to be re-elected, that is likely to raise some very serious questions about NATO, given his highly controversial and well-publicised views about NATO not being a particularly desirable institution, that he regards as a drag on the United States, as something that the United States is paying for and shouldn't be paying for. And given also his views about Ukraine and his views very frequently stated while he was in office and not changed since, that he would like to see the United States cooperate more with Russia. As he used to say, getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. So if we are facing a situation in which we have an American leadership that is less engaged in NATO, I think that is going to, it is what the sensible thing would be for other states in NATO to work around this, right? To recognise that there needs to be more engagement with other European institutions to address kind of gaps that are created by this. And I think, I mean, obviously I wouldn't presume to speak for the United Kingdom, but it seems to me that in that scenario, the European Union and the United Kingdom might well be more likely to work cooperatively together on defence questions in or outside of the NATO framework. So that was a very broad brush answer. I apologise, but those are some thoughts.
Thank you very much again. Yes, very interesting thoughts. So some worries about the position of the United States after the next elections, but the need for the European countries in any case to better cooperate. And maybe I turn now to the other panelists, and I thought maybe of turning to you, Nikolai van Ondarza, to bring in another word that we have heard a lot in the recent times, the word strategic autonomy. So the idea of strategic autonomy is that the European Union will be in a better position to take care of its own needs, and that could also be in the field of defense. And nobody really knows what it concretely means or how we could get about it. You have published on these things. Could you maybe share some thoughts with us?
Yeah, first, thank you very much for having me. And it is indeed a very broad discussion. If we talk about European strategic autonomy or sovereignty, it often has many different areas, including financial sovereignty, economic sovereignty, in the digital sphere. And in many of these areas, the EU is very strong, but its weakest links is always the defense side. And if we look at the past 1.5 years, we really saw a sort of zigzag course in the debate about European strategic sovereignty. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the huge American support for Ukraine has almost killed the concept. Many in Central and Eastern Europe stressed very much, you cannot talk about strategic autonomy if it means autonomy from the United States. You have just seen how crucial the US is for the defense of Europe. But now with the US election on the horizon, and we've just heard the doubts about the sustainability of the American guarantee for Europe, this question is reviving again. And so if we look at the sort of time scale of this report, 2035, there is really a crucial question ahead for the European countries, not whether they can be autonomous from the United States, but whether they can really increase their autonomous capabilities to at least replace if the United States becomes a little bit less active and less supportive in Europe. And there's also a second dimension, and that's maybe the even more difficult for the European countries, which is the dilemma between the need for quick building up of European capabilities and building up an industrial structure in Europe, because many member states now are increasing their defense budgets. And if they're looking for quick solutions, they want to buy off the shelf, which is often American, South Korean, other defense procurements. But then if they want to build up a European defense industrial base, they would really have to scale up European industry, which takes a longer time. And this is, I think, one of the dilemmas that's also reflected in the different scenarios, whether the European countries can build up the will to say, okay, we buy some of the shelf, American, South Korean, and so on, but we also invest in our own joint capabilities to slowly but surely build up a European defense industrial base to also, in this pillar of European strategic sovereignty, increase the EU's own capabilities.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. I'll come back to you on strategic autonomy later when we talk about the EU itself. But I think it's time now to move to the next topic and also to the next panelist, and the topic of enlargement. And then I would like to move to our colleague Jana Jozova. Jana is head of the Global Europe program in the Institute for European Policy Europeum, and its main location is in Prague. So welcome, Jana.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting debate.
It's a very timely topic because the Commission last week brought out the reports, and we have read that it is recommended to open accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, and also to grant candidate status to Georgia. So it seems that we are moving to a next phase, and most people think it's likely that the European Council in December will follow these recommendations. And that brings us to a fundamental underlying question: how ready are the member states and how ready are the European populations for such a next wave of enlargement? We note that, of course, although there is also support, there is also, let's say, hesitance, even in countries that very strongly support Ukraine, like Poland, for instance. We see that there is fear with the farmers and the truckers for competition from Ukraine, and other member states have other topics of concern. So could you maybe enlighten us a bit about national attitudes in EU member states towards enlargement?
Okay, look, I think it was already mentioned by Wolfgang, and in the beginning, in the introductions, how challenging in accession of Ukraine into the European Union sometime in the future will be, and how difficult task it will be for not only Ukraine but also for the European Union to be prepared for such a large enlargement, the biggest since 2004, basically. And if you ask about the concerns of the EU member states and their populations and how ready the member states are, because I believe Nikolai will talk a bit more about the EU as a whole and its preparedness for the enlargement. But when we focus on the member states, I would say there are basically three main concerns or groups of concerns regarding Ukraine's EU membership. And the first one and the most dominant one is always about the money, as everything at the end of the day is about the financial resources. Here, what we are seeing, there is quite some level of anxiousness among most of the EU member states when it comes to the question how much it will cost us. And here, of course, there are two main issues, I would say. One, we touched upon this, is the farmers and agriculture policy, the common agriculture policy of the EU, and what inclusion of Ukraine in this policy would actually mean for the current member states, the main beneficiaries of this policy, which are primarily France, Spain, and Germany, so large EU member states. And the second aspect is the structural and cohesion funds. And here again, the question is, what would it mean for the countries, primarily from the Central and Eastern Europe, who are at this moment the net beneficiaries of these funds? Whether it would actually mean that they will move to the position of net contributors, or they won't be eligible to such large amounts as they are now, what it would mean for the public opinion, because coming from Czech Republic, I have to say that unfortunately still in the new EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, a strong argument for EU membership is how much it actually advantages us in terms of economy and how many funds we are eligible for. So if this changed, would it mean the public support for EU membership would change potentially in these countries? Would it be, would people actually focus more on aspects like the loss of sovereignty and the need to compromise on important issue while we are not getting that much money as we are at this moment? What I have to say is, or bring to your attention, is quite a recent Eurobarometer focused on the public opinion about various aspects of EU support for Ukraine. One of them was also the support for Ukraine's integration into the European Union. And here I found it quite worrying because except for Cyprus, which showed the least support for integration of Ukraine into the EU, unfortunately, the other countries with least public support were Slovakia, which was also below 50% of support, then Czech Republic and Hungary with 50%. This is very surprising, I would say, even for me, because, well, of course, the situation is different in Hungary, but for example, the Czech Republic at the political level is very, very supportive of Ukraine and its European aspirations. But then the public mood is quite different. So what we are seeing now is several studies which are actually focusing on the financial impacts of Ukraine's EU accession. And what is quite interesting is that their conclusions and the numbers they arrive to actually differ significantly. So there has been the reports, especially in media, about the internal document of the Council of the EU with calculations on the financial impacts of Ukraine's membership, which is quite negative, I would say, and quite substantial. It states that, for example, in the agriculture policy, it would mean 20% less of the funds available for current EU member states. It also states that most of the current net beneficiaries of EU funds, structural funds, would actually move to net contributors. But on the other hand, there was also the recent study by authors from a Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and they have way more optimistic conclusions where they basically say that according to their calculations and estimates, none of the current net beneficiaries from Central and Eastern Europe would become net contributor, and the financial consequences would not be that dramatic. So we can see that we work with many unknowns. There are many questions, many variables that we just cannot predict. Of course, one of them, quite naturally, is the outcome of the war, which nobody can predict at this point very well. Then there's the question of the Russian frozen assets and how the EU and individual countries will be actually able to use it to help Ukraine. And also the question is how well the reconstruction of Ukraine and recovery will be actually going, and how much the international support from other sources than just the European Union will actually help to boost Ukrainian economy and prepare it to become more prepared for EU membership.
Well, thank you. So a lot of worries about money, although some think tanks are more optimistic than others. But could you say one more thing about other worries for other member states? There was also the rule of law, of course. We are worried maybe people about corruption. How do you think that will play out in the support for enlargement?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I thought I was taking already a bit too long. But when we talk about the other concerns, of course, one of them is about the functioning of the European Union of 30 plus members, including such a huge country as Ukraine is. So in terms of institutional functioning, and quite an important part of it is, or it can be also considered as an aspect and concern of its own, it's the rule of law issue. And we are still sometimes viewing the 2004 enlargement as quite a, there's this stigma connected with the erosion of the rule of law within the European Union due to the enlargement. And there is still some fear that another enlargement to post-communist parts of Europe can potentially enhance this illiberal alliance or part of the European Union. So what we are seeing is mostly from the Netherlands, but also from some Nordic countries, very strict reliance on conditionality in the pre-accession phase, which of course is very important. But in order to somehow guarantee or try to guarantee that there won't be any backsliding once these countries actually become members of the European Union, because this is what happened with the Visegrad countries, for example. They were doing much better in terms of democratic preparedness than they are doing nowadays. Then the European Union actually has to be able to somehow strengthen its own rule of law mechanisms for the current EU member states and for the future members. And when we talk about the functioning of the European Union, and here I don't want to dive too much into it because, again, I believe Nikolai will talk more about it. The discussed issues like the allocation of the members of the seats in the European Parliament, and these changes or the number of commissioners, these are all important questions, but they are not that problematic as is the voting in the Council of the European Union and the potential increase in number of veto players in different decisions. So again, this will be very difficult discussion. Again, coming from the Czech Republic, we have a group of countries, unfortunately also from Central and Eastern Europe mostly, who are supportive of enlargement, but in the same time they are afraid to lose their veto power. So they are sort of avoiding this discussion about the reform of the European Union before enlargement. So yeah, I think I will stop here and I will be happy to answer some questions later on.
Yes, I will come to Nikolai in a moment indeed to talk more about the functioning of the Union. But before I turn to Nikolai again, I have one last question for you, Jana, and that is about another important aspect of enlargement. This question between, on the one hand, that it's a merit-based process based on the Copenhagen criteria, very strict criteria that everybody has to fulfill. And on the other hand, that people say, well, you might go with groups like in 2004, just not one country or two countries, but go for groups. And then we see already in some countries in the Western Balkans who are much longer involved in the accession process, that there are some feelings of, let's say, the idea that Ukraine gets preferential treatment because of the war and could accede maybe even faster than they could. So a group approach or a regatta approach, as they call it, might be a way to tackle these issues. Do you have a short thought for us to share on this dilemma?
Okay, first I will say what worked in 2004 enlargement and for our region and or in particular for the Visegrad group, it seems not to be working already for the Western Balkans very well. And it's also a question whether what is being applied to the Western Balkans could work or better or worse for the associated trio countries. For example, for Central and Eastern Europe, this group approach was actually fine. I have to say that there was also a high level of solidarity, now talking about the Visegrad countries in particular, because while Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary were part of the Luxembourg group, which was more advanced, better prepared, and was expected to join the European Union earlier in 2004 eventually, Slovakia was in the group of laggers, let's say, together with Bulgaria, Romania and other countries. So regional cooperation here and the good regional relations proved to be very instrumental, because the other three Visegrad countries actually joined forces and helped Slovakia after the fall of the authoritarian Mečiar regime in 1998 to catch up with the rest of the group. And eventually it succeeded and all countries joined the EU together in 2004. We don't see this in the Western Balkans. Most of the regional initiatives seem to be still externally imposed by the European Union. There is lack of regional ownership. And we don't see much solidarity, to be honest. So here in this case, I think having a regional approach or a group approach to these countries, while we can hope it would boost this solidarity and working together, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. On the contrary, if we actually keep, let's say, some countries which are more prepared or show more efforts stuck in the waiting room together with their neighbors who are not doing such a good job, because we prefer to have this group approach, then it can cause much more frustrations. It can be another blow to EU's credibility, and it could result in quite a negative consequences. Now the question is about the associated trio, which is new in this race, in this game. And here I will be also kind of afraid that actually there seems to be this tendency to couple Ukraine and Moldova. But as we discussed, absorbing Ukraine will be an enormous challenge for the European Union, while in the case of Moldova, it might not be such a challenging task. And I would be afraid that at some point we could arrive to the point in time when both countries could be actually ready to join the European Union, or they could have done quite a lot of work on their side. But because of this EU's inability and potentially lack of political will to accept Ukraine as such a huge country with all the consequences, Moldova would be also blocked by this unpreparedness of the EU. So again, I think in this wave of enlargement, merit-based approach, very fair approach, and letting each of the countries individually progress according to their own reform efforts would be better.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a clear and interesting position. So not easy to get all these accession countries online. And then Nikolai, I turn to you. So Nikolai van Ondarza, you are head of the EU Europe division in the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Germany, based in Berlin. Welcome again. And let's look a bit closer to this question of EU reform. So how can the EU prepare itself for enlargement, in particularly when it involves many new countries? There is, of course, a technical side to this. There is a much legal side to this, and you have been part of a Franco-German working group that looked much deeper into this than we could do in our report. So maybe you could talk a bit about the ideas that you developed in that group, and also in particular look at the question that it seems that in the member states there is not much appetite to go for real treaty reform in the form of a big institutional change. And if that is the case, then would all these other forms of reform outside the treaty be enough to prepare the European Union for new enlargement? So how do you see these things, Nikolai?
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. And I think indeed, if we look at the size and different sizes of the potential upcoming enlargement, I find it almost indisputable that there will be need for some institutional adaptation of the EU. The only question is how far-reaching that is. Just to make it sort of a little bit more visible, ironically, if we take together the population size of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, so leaving out Turkey for now, where the accession is at least paused for the foreseeable future, you end up roughly with the population of the United Kingdom, which has just left the European Union. But you have 9 times the vetoes in any unanimity decisions. You would have 9 times the commissioners, and you have about twice the numbers of members in the European Parliament, because small countries get a bigger representation in the European Parliament. So only if you just look at this gravity of how it would change at the EU, you will see that there would be necessities to adapt all the different institutions in the EU. And in our Franco-German report, which was mandated but independent from the 2 governments, we made proposals how to do that in the Parliament, in the Commission, suggesting very much also in the Council for an increase of qualified majority voting, also with some safeguards, and trying to make proposals how the EU can adapt in 2030-35 for that. And I think this will really be one of the major tasks for the next legislative cycle, to conduct these 2 processes hand in hand. On the one hand, accelerating the accession procedures, and on the other hand, having a structured process to agree amongst the member states and the EU institutions on how to reform, to prepare for the EU to accept new members. But as you said, also in the reaction to our report and the growing discussions that we've had and ahead of the council meeting, or the informal council meeting in Granada, I think you can say that there are 3 different schools of thoughts in the EU. The one is maybe best represented in the European Parliament, where the Constitutional Committee, the AFCO, is preparing a report for a more fundamental reform of the EU, which goes in the old tradition of enlarging and deepening of the EU together. So really using that enlargement to fundamentally deepen the EU. Then the second school of thought, and this is, I would say, more in light of where the German and French governments are heading, who are saying we need enlargement and reform together. So not necessarily deepening with new competences, but only adapting the EU institutions, but still in a fashion that requires changes of the treaty, for instance, on the just mentioned qualified majority voting. And then there's maybe a third school of countries which says the treaties are enlargement ready, and that such a large enlargement is possible without adapting the treaties, by using lots of passerelle and flexibility clauses, and I would say politically to avoid referendums and the painful process of treaty change. And those are not just countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Just to pick out a different example, for instance, Ireland is very much in favor of enlargement, but has to have referendums on any kind of treaty change, and therefore would prefer a route of adapting the EU institutions without that. And from how I view the situation today, is I can see that there is a growing consensus amongst EU member states that we have to have these 2 processes enlargement and reform hand in hand in the next legislative period, but no consensus yet how far-reaching these reforms will have to happen. And I think this is where, again, the scenarios of your report comes in. It will really define sort of how enlargement is processing, how the war is going, and how big also potentially the pressure is on the EU member states to commit to enlargement, whether there is potentially a majority in the next legislative period to also tackle the question of treaty change. And to end with that, I personally believe the use of the flexibility clauses will not be enough. That if you really look at the issues that are being brought up by such a huge enlargement, and also to rebalance some of the power between member states, if you think about extending qualified majority voting, that at the end of the day, there is a necessity to minor but not real fundamental adaptations of the treaties.
Thank you, Nicolai. I see Mr. GAHLER wants to throw in a question. Mr. GAHLER.
Yeah, very quickly on these institutional considerations and relatively on how to overcome the challenges that go with enlargement. I just had last weekend in Ukraine and yesterday morning during a breakfast with Western Balkans ambassadors, we had raised these issues, how to address some of the challenges. And when it was about well, the necessity to overcome the veto and the danger that through enlargement we would have more veto powers. I heard it already long before in Ukraine, this suggestion, okay, if that is your point, we can, as a precondition for accession, we can deny or drop our right on a veto. It is nothing that is definitely daily happening. Yesterday, as anyhow, the tendency would have to go towards qualified majority in a foreign and security policy, as that is the objective of the existing members, or should be. The new ones could be ready to accept it, so to say, with exception to not to have a veto, but of course to have their vote, but not a veto. And the other aspect was that some of the Western Balkan countries said, oh, you know, we desperately need to get in. We don't need a commissioner, but we need to get in the EU. I think so. So this argument could also be perhaps partly be addressed. We can think of commissioners without a portfolio, like ministers without a portfolio in national governments, to avoid too many bureaucracy. And with the parliament, I mean, unfortunately, we are apparently enlarging the amount of seats up to, I think, 720 or so for the next election that has been decided. That should have been avoided. We still have some margin of maneuver up to 751. And if it were only about perhaps to have a slight enlargement overall through a treaty change, I think that is something that the council could swallow as a treaty change. So I think institutionally we could cope with it. The financial aspects, we have absorbed the huge enlargement 2004 and a bit more in 2007, especially with regard to agriculture. I'm confident we would be able to address that in a proper way as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. GAHLER, for this addition, because let me bring that into the second question I wanted to ask Nicolai, and that is about the diversity of an enlarged EU. Because in that Franco-German group, Nicolai, you also plea for a multi-speed or a diverse European Union. And that brings up two questions. So the first question is indeed, like Mr. GAHLER said, are countries really ready to have different kinds of engagements? And so we hear now that they might be. There might be countries without a commissioner or countries without a veto. And the second question it brings up is if you go for a diversification, don't you undermine the coherence of the Union? And that brings me then back to that topic of strategic autonomy that I said I would come back to. On the one hand, if more countries adhere to the European Union, they all will implement the so-called acquis communautaire, the European legislation. So we'll have a bigger block of countries, a bigger market, and that could be a bigger, stronger bloc also in the world. That's the one side of it. And on the other side, if it's a very diverse bloc with very internal different competences, but also maybe with different speeds, that could then a little bit undermine that cohesion. So could you share some thoughts in 2 minutes or 3 minutes on this?
Yes, I'll try to stick to 2 or 3 minutes. I think it's very important to have that debate, and also in reaction to our report, we learned how sensitive that is. In many member states, there's this fear of becoming member states of second class. And even if there now might be saying that countries would be willing to forfeit their veto or their commissioners once they're inside the EU, they will ask the questions, are we now members of a second class? So I think we have to be really sensitive about this issue. But my second point is we cannot avoid this discussion. We already have a lot of differentiation in the EU, the Eurozone, Schengen, enhanced cooperation, permanent structured cooperation in defense. And if we look at an EU of 30, 35 countries, then we can easily see the how the incentives will rise for member states to where they cannot agree all 35 to find solutions that are more differentiated. And I think what we try to say in our Franco-German report is if we have this differentiation, we should attach it to the EU institutions as close as possible. So don't do it intergovernmental outside the EU with the big countries getting together without the parliament, without the commission just doing their own things, but rather say, let's use differentiation within the EU, like tools that we have, like enhanced cooperation, where there's full involvement of the EU institutions. And also there's clear from the beginning that each member state that wants to, and maybe fulfills the criteria, like on the Eurozone, can take part, so that it's not an exclusive club excluding countries, but rather one instrument to bring countries together. And then this can actually strengthen European strategic autonomy because you don't only need unity, you also need capability. So if you, let's say, for instance, in the field of foreign and security affairs, if you say there's an unanimous agreement on a policy, but only parts of the member states are willing to contribute forces to foreign EU military operations, or some of the EU member states form a contact group to work on a specific diplomatic issue. I think their differentiation, as long as it's tied to the EU institutions and it's clear the intent is not to exclude other countries, but bring together those more willing, then I think it can help to strengthen the EU.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for doing that in 2 to 3 minutes. Yeah, that's very interesting. So a kind of inclusive diversification, if I may call it, diversification, but everybody can jump on the train whenever they like. I think it's time now for the fourth and last panelist that I turn to you, Yevgen. So let me introduce Yevgen Kilimnik. He's a regional project manager in the innovation team at the Istanbul Regional Hub of the United Nations Development Program. And that doesn't mean that he is working on Turkey, the fact that it's based in Istanbul, but you are working on the whole region, including Ukraine, right? And so welcome, Yevgen. And with you, I would like to talk a little bit more on the Ukrainian side of it all, because we have discussed now a lot the European Union and what it means for internal reform there, and how enlargement looks from the view of the European Union, but how does it look like from the other side? And let's first maybe address the issue of reconstruction. So we talked about money. Reconstruction is about money, lots of money. The good news is that the European Commission has proposed this Ukraine facility, 15 billion up to 2027. That's a lot of money. On the other hand, when we compare, there was this assessment made by the Ukrainian government that you would need 750 billion US dollars in this case until 2032 for repairing all the damage done. And that was in, I think, somewhere in 2022 that this estimate was made, and it's probably increasing since. So we still miss a lot of money, and we all understand that private investment is needed, but the private investors say, well, we wait until the situation is safe and secure. So we wait until we get either security guarantees or a specific insurance. So how to get out of this catch-22 situation, and how to get the money on the table to be able to work on the reconstruction? What are your views?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and return to our conversations. And indeed, my work is covering Ukraine. And at the time we worked with you, and as I worked in Ukraine for Ukraine Country Office of United Nations. And maybe before going into the how might we overcome the vast gap in the recovery funding need, I wanted to say actually that with all the scenarios and uncertainties and unknown unknowns and unknown unknowns, there is one thing that is known, and this is the Ukrainian direction towards the becoming a member of EU. And just today I looked at what EU accession means for Ukrainian population. And then this is also something that we touched on in our conversations. Of course, it means long-term strategic security. So there are people responding to it. It means economic perspective, but also equally, almost equally as to those two factors, it is about the future of Ukrainian democracy. It is about the observance of rule of law, and it is about the recognition of Ukraine as a part of the of Europe and European Union. So I think all of the there were some concerns mentioned about the rule of law in the among the previous discussions. From the population itself, it is also viewed as a way to ensure rule of law and democratic principles to govern. And then now back to the huge financial gap, and indeed there are different assessments going on. There is also an assessment that is done by the World Bank together with UN organizations, where already by the middle of last year, the assessment was also around 380 billion, only to build back what was destroyed, not taking into account the economic opportunity lost. So hence the assessments and methods of assess of what is lost are very different, and now it's counting to enormous sums of money. And if we're again talking about what was lost, is again UNDP made assessment in March 2022, so a year and a half ago, that at that time, at the very beginning of the destruction and invasion, there were 18 years of development lost. So Ukraine finds itself in a position of really being thrown back behind in economic hurdles, but also basically the security situation redefined the economic sectors that can go ahead. And then depending again on the scenarios that we've elaborated with you, we could see on different different factors and different priority sectors emerging. And overall, I would address my answer in two sides. So first, we need to think about the priority sectors. And here, I think Ukraine would very much align with what is proposed from the EU side, which is twin transition, both green and digital, advocating for environmentally sustainable economic development with focus on renewable energies, but then also working on fostering the emerging industries. Right now, one of the pillars of Ukrainian resilience was the digital response and the digital resilience. And Ukraine is investing a lot with support of international partners in the digital economy, digital skills of massive populations that are moved beyond Ukraine and within Ukraine. So that is one of the priority sectors for recovery. But then collectively with you, with European Union, internationals, we will have to innovate with financial instruments, looking at the new types of bonds, impact bonds, maybe diaspora bonds that would unlock access to financial mechanisms, or even bonds that are conditioned for opening land for agriculture after the enormous amounts being currently blocked and not able to be used for economic activity. And of course, the discussion that is happening in Ukraine and the EU on the use of seized funds for recovery is definitely helpful and should be further looked in. And I know there are different options being discussed around it. But I also want to say that not only looking for the sources where Ukraine would get funding, it's important to invest time in proper recovery governance. And the recovery governance should ensure not only the transparent use of the funds, coherent planning, but also help to demonstrate tangible results that are already happening right now, regardless of which scenario are we going into out of 4 that you are presenting. That would keep a very public and public support and hope and motivation for people both to return to Ukraine, because there are 6 million around 6 million internally Ukrainians under temporary protection in EU, and about the same time same amounts displaced in Ukraine. So this tangible right now, regardless of any scenario, that we are both as Ukraine, as international community committed, that's a very important moment to incentivize those larger funds that might come soon. I'll stop here and happy to discuss further.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are approaching the time that we will also take questions from the audience. A quick look in the chat. I don't see too many questions, but I encourage all the people in the audience to put their questions in the chat if they have any. But before we go there, Yevgen, yeah, you already touched upon it. There's another aspect I want to talk about. It's not only about money. The reconstruction is also about a whole societal effort to build up a new society in Ukraine. And this involves, as we discussed, much more than just money. Just to mention that you have been also on another Foresight project with people from the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, and there was also involvement from the UK here. And in that project, you also worked on scenarios, but more for the development internally in Ukraine. So maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about that very interesting project, which had a time horizon of 2040. And just to specify the question, in those scenarios, there were, let's say, quite some worrying elements that things could also go wrong for Ukraine. Like even after the war, there could be a new autocracy around a new, very centralized government, or there could be corruption with reconstruction money if it comes in, or there could be feelings of envy between the western parts of the country and the eastern parts of the country, because most of the money might go to eastern parts, especially if you recapture the annexed territories. How do you integrate all these people? So many challenges inside Ukraine, de-urbanization to name another. Could you say something about those scenarios and also how to overcome those troubles and give us a more positive perspective on that for Ukraine?
Yes, thank you, Mario. Indeed, that was a very interesting project that I supported, led by the parliament of a group of members of parliament from Ukraine and from the UK. And like it was mentioned in the beginning, the scenarios are not predictions. They are meant to raise an important policy questions into discussion and raise and nudge the policymakers and society to think on what issues might we be facing ahead. So the risk that you mentioned, they actually come not from the full. They come actually from the kind of a frozen war scenario that you also that are also similarly presented in your report, where actually the strategic security of Ukraine is not fully ensured, and hence the further centralization and command and control are kept in the center, and that leads into certain further risks. But as a part of our work with the parliament, we did also work out a series of recommendations, which are also then being, after 6 months of publishing or a bit more, I see that they are being worked on and addressed. And that's number one is the work on continued decentralization of governance in Ukraine. So despite the martial law and despite the so-called centralization that is happening as a part of military response, we see that the local communities are still very much empowered to act, and they have the right to plan certain development budgets where it's available, and taking ownership for the situation on the ground. And this is something that would overcome the challenges that you mentioned, and would it's a part of Ukrainian resilience. Decentralized response, independent, self-organized. We continue seeing this in Ukraine as we speak. And second is again the importance to invest in, like you said, that the institutional setup of EU needs to be looked in. Same here. We need to further strengthen the parliamentary oversight and the role of civil society and media in overseeing the government's decisions. And if I reflect on the recent 6 months, I already start seeing that the landscape has changed. So civil society is again very vocal, implementing their watchdogging role, and so on. And this is extremely good to see. And of course, the role of there has been for many years an EU investment to work on public administration reform, enhancing civil service attractiveness by providing high quality learning. That should be also continued. And then the last part, so decentralization, quality of governance, and then social cohesion. That's again things that international partners like UNDP and the government of Ukraine is working right now, promoting social cohesion right now towards internally displaced people, working with the host communities, helping them to reintegrate. And many territories are now liberated. The returnees are being reintegrated back into the community, and we see that would be a very important part. And luckily, we have some learning and support from the partners. And then probably I'll end by saying again that a huge investment is, regardless again of the scenario, is required to prioritize the social recovery, addressing the mental health issue, PTSD, re-education programs, those things that need to be planned in already now. And I believe if we work on all levels, quality of national governance, empowered decentralization in financial terms and governance, and social cohesion, that risks of disputes, internal challenges, they would be addressed.
Many, many thanks, Yevgen, for those insights. We have 13 minutes left until 3 o'clock, and it's really time to turn to the audience now. I see a few questions in the chat, but I want to give the floor to my colleague Virginia Mahieu, because you have followed them, and maybe you can summarize them for us.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been really interesting to listen to. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. The first from Susanna Angel, who's asking about Black Sea security. So I believe this question is directed to Ruth. How this would fit into the new European security architecture and what the EU can do in strengthening security in the Black Sea. That's one question. And then I think we can also pose the second question to Nikolai, maybe straight afterwards, which is talking about strategic autonomy in the industrial defense space and whether there is a need to reinvent the wheel. Wouldn't it be a better strategy to focus on making the industrial base that complements the needs of other NATO members? So how do you foster cooperation by design that aligns these incentives? So we can start with those, and there's more coming in, so I'll have to do some reading in the meantime.
Thank you, Virginia. Two pretty straightforward questions. So first, Ruth, the Black Sea.
Yeah, I mean, what the EU can actually do in terms of enhancing Black Sea security is something I think I would need to think about a little more. I mean, what I would say is that I think it's going to be a critical question for the European Union and for NATO, because one of the things that the current conflict has shown is that perhaps far more than was previously recognised, European security as a whole is dependent on Black Sea security, and there are going to be some difficult questions, ongoing difficult questions and discussions, I think, about how that is, how security in the Black Sea region is made possible, and particularly how that becomes possible in any scenario where Russia retains occupation of Crimea. Because it seems to me, and this is more a question, I guess, for NATO than the European Union, but it certainly seems to me that any scenario in which Russia retains occupation of Crimea is a scenario in which European Union member states are vulnerable in security and economic terms to further Russian interference, Russian aggression. So I don't have any answers on that, I'm afraid, but all I would say is I think it is one of the most important questions that comes out of the conflict for all member states and for European states beyond the EU.
Thank you, Ruth. And then the next question for you, Nikolai, on the defense base.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. And I think I very much agree with the spirit of the question. If the experience of the last 1.5 years has shown us anything, is that if we talk about strengthening European military capabilities and European strategic sovereignty, it cannot be against NATO or against the United States, but it needs to happen in a Euro-Atlantic framework, regardless what comes out of the next US elections. So this should never be EU against NATO or EU against the United States. But the second point is what we've also learned is really how fragmented European defense industry has become and how difficult it is to scale up in times of need. Just to give an example, the EU has that target of 1 million rounds of ammunition for Ukraine until next March, and it's really struggling. European defense industry is really struggling to scale up the production capacity to reach that target. And I think therefore, if we go for if we look at that huge time span, 2035, there will be a need to incrementally, in a Euro-Atlantic context, bring together a European defense industry, both to remain compatible with NATO standards, but also increase the capabilities of our own industries to create these kind of things we need, especially if we look at the more negative scenarios that have been brought up.
Thank you. Mr. GAHLER wants to come in before I turn to the next.
Yes, very quickly. I totally agree. I mean, every activity that we do serves both purposes, both strengthening a European pillar of NATO and also strengthening our own base, both industrial base and our own capabilities, in case there is no recourse to NATO resources possible. I mean, if Mr. Erdogan has something against it, there is no recourse to NATO resources if we want to do something as EU. So we must still be able to be autonomous in this regard. But the other thing that you referred to, I mean, it's a shame that we are not in a position within a year to produce these 1 million that we promised to Ukraine. The German foreign defense minister just admitted it. I mean, we should have. I was involved because money from EDIRPA regulation was shifted to the ASAP, the Act in Support of Ammunition Production, with the argument we need to enlarge the capacity in order to be able to produce the 1 million. But what we should have done is also clearly, with the money foreseen overall for the 1 million, we should have bought it in third states and not restrict ourselves to EU production. The purpose of this is to support Ukraine, and it is not in the short notice or at short term to support our industry. It's the purpose, the war currently, and that is the mistake. We can still change it. We can still buy in Turkey or wherever there is capacity, because the need is there for Ukraine to get the 1 million and more.
Thank you very much, Mr. GAHLER, for this addition. I think looking at the time, we go for the last round of questions. I see there are some new ones in the chat. So Virginia, can you sum them up for us?
Sure, yeah. So the next in the chat is a comment. Maybe anyone wants to react to it. It's from Veronika Bondarenko, mentioning that raising funds for Ukrainian reconstruction will largely depend on the EU's own success with building strong capital markets, which is also important for the EU digital and sustainable transition. So it's not a question as such, but if anyone wants to react to that, go ahead. But then we also have a specific question for Jana Yuzova, because this is from Niels Elrich. You mentioned the accession of Moldova should not be tied to the accession of Ukraine as a lesson learned from the accession of Western Balkans. But what other lessons would you draw from previous accession rounds, in particular for institutions and administrative capacity?
Okay, capital markets and administrative capacity. Capital markets, I don't know. Is there anybody who would like to react to that? We don't have those experts on board, maybe. I leave it in the air for a moment, and let's turn then to you, Jana, on the lessons learned.
Yes, so of course, very, very valid question, because this is a huge issue, not only for the Western Balkans currently dealing with the lack of administrative capacities in the administration and the ability to, tied to it, absorb the funds available and potentially increasing in the future. But this is something that also the so-called new EU member states are still struggling with, and this is something that gets built up only over time. And in this regard, what I think, or it could be a solution, at least partially, is the discussions about potential phasing in or gradual integration or staged accession, because this would mean that the candidate countries would actually have access to certain EU institutions, agencies, or working bodies, and also gradually increasing funds, which would enable them to build up the expertise to motivate the people by possibly being able to provide more competitive salaries in the state administration, and to basically equip their institutions and their civil servants with the skills that they actually need already in the pre-accession phase.
Thank you very much. I get a message from the host that we can go 10 minutes over time. Of course, there may be people who will have to leave at 3 o'clock. So if people leave at 3 o'clock, I thank them for participating, and I hope you thought it interesting. I see we have still 100 people online. We had 130 at the peak moment. So then we do another round of questions. Virginia.
Sure, yeah. So again, we have one very specific question, so we'll see if anyone wants to pick it up, which is how the EU will ensure disability inclusion and protection of the rights of persons with disabilities within the Ukraine facility, and in particular the Ukraine plan. Again, if anyone wants to answer that. And then we have a very general question, which is about the expectations on both sides regarding accession that are very, very high. And so with the prospect of 2035 in mind, and these high expectations regarding rule of law, corruption, democracy, how do we manage these expectations so that we don't have a great disappointment on both sides, potentially leading to unnecessary crisis on the road to Ukraine's accession to the EU? So
on the disabilities issue, as I'm the co-rapporteur for the Ukraine facility, we have at several points we have made specific reference to the need to address these issues. So that is being dealt with in the text added to the draft from the Commission. So we have our trilogue, of course, but I think this issue, to make a specific reference at several occasions, is not controversial, or should not be, with the Council. And the other thing with the corruption and all this, I think, having watched Ukraine over many years, there is this real engagement, I always say, from the real reformers in Ukraine, from the civil society, and this demand from the citizens. I mean, the citizens went on 2 revolutions in order to fight the oligarchic system and the systemic corruption. And I think everybody has understood it. And they have installed already quite some well-working institutions, NABU, ZAPO, High Anti-Corruption Court, ProZorro, such, and there are others, partly, of course, by the war paralyzed or not so functional, or the e-declaration for income of relevant persons. There is a lot ongoing, and I'm pretty sure, as now there is also the clear perspective for European Union legislative framework for as soon as they are inside. Those who thought earlier, I'm in the Wild East, not in the Wild West, but in the Wild East, and I behave like in the old days. Now they know that their future is only in the EU, and that they know if they want to retain what they have grabbed, perhaps they have to embrace from now on the rule of law and join anti-corruption with all the others that I have named.
Thank you, Mr. GAHLER. That reminds me of a film after 1990 called Der Wilde Osten, but that was the other enlargement. And still upcoming. Yeah, then the question on the expectations. Why don't we make this a sort of a final round? I would like to hear maybe first from Yevgen. Expectations also on the Ukrainian side, if you have some addition also to what Mr. GAHLER said. And then turn to Jana, then to Nikolai, and then end with Ruth, because we started with Ruth. How's that? Yevgen.
Yeah, I thank you. And I spotted that question, and I was reflecting while listening to other colleagues talking. Indeed, we are as Ukrainian societies experiences war. We have a huge expectation, and we need to keep our spirits high in order to continue to withhold with all the horrible things that are happening. And we saw in one, we are now reflecting after a year and a half of war that how the government communicated, and there was certain promises, expectations set, and so on. Now we start to feel a bit of sorrow that not everything as we hope, that it's not, that the war is still in our territory and it's still not resolved. But I think this more and slowly the reality is coming back to us, and I think similar approach we should apply for EU accession. I think now for us is not the time of mediocre expectations. I think it's like the scale of ambition is so high, and I think we would need your support, our support, and the full everybody around Ukraine need to keep this ambition high, actually to fulfill it, because it's if we've discussed such a different and difficult context for 1.5 hours today, and all of them require extra effort at every and most dimensions. So let's keep the expectations high, and if it happens so that not all of that is going to be met, we will align, I think. So yeah, I would say let's keep ambition high. Thank you.
Let's keep the ambitions up. Jana, what do you think? Expectations?
Yeah, well, I will focus more on the EU side, and I have to say I was also a bit worried when I saw, especially in the first half year, let's say, around the application for membership of Ukraine and Moldova, these very, very positive and encouraging statements from the European representatives, but which were hardly, matching the reality of the enlargement process. And the EU actually learned quite a bitter lesson in the Western Balkans, where big expectations, which the EU and individual EU member states were not able to deliver on, actually caused a lot of frustrations and possibly reversed the trends in some countries. And here I think the communication is the key. I think the Ukrainian government, of course, it has to be ambitious. Consider the context. Ambition is definitely a good thing, and it should be aiming high. But in the same time, the communication towards the population should be honest. It will be a long process, it will be a difficult process, and it will depend on many things which are not sometimes entirely in the hands of the Ukrainian government and people. So that's one side. And on the other hand, I would hope that in the private meetings, the EU representatives are also more realistic in what they are promising to Ukraine and their representatives, and in communicating how difficult this road actually is, and that there are potentials for blockages, not entirely at the fault of Ukraine, and so on. So I also think that if these promises should be credible, the EU really needs to advance with its internal EU reform, and also on the question of veto power in the enlargement process as such, because this can cause a lot of frustrations for Ukraine down the road.
Thank you. And then Nikolai.
Yeah, very much following on what Jana had said. I think there's a real danger of a conflict between the geostrategic interest of the EU to have a speedy accession process, to have no more gray zones in Europe and bring these countries as close to the EU as possible, and the very technocratic nature of the accession process, with all these vetoes having to go over through all the laws, coming closer to the EU. And we see that with the process. I mean, Ukraine and Moldova got the candidate status last summer, and now it's over a year later, and we're talking about opening up the accession negotiations really by the end of this year. And this opening up of accession negotiations means that there will then be a long screening of Ukrainian laws even before the first chapters can be opened. So I think we really have to set expectations correctly, high and ambitious, but really say this is a process that will take a decade or more. It is not something that can be done on a fast track. And this for me means, secondly, we need to find solutions for the time in between, some flexible, innovative thinking to bring these countries as close to the EU as possible. There are many ideas out there: staged accession, phasing in. The German Foreign Minister Baerbock recently had the idea of including accession countries which align with the EU foreign and security policies at meetings of the General Affairs Councils or other EU meetings. And I think it's these kind of innovative thinking that we need in order to, on the one hand, say realistic expectations. This is a decade-long process, but we do something in between to give you benefits on the road and to bring you closer as possible while we are in that long accession process.
Realistic expectations, phasing in. Interesting thoughts. Ruth, yeah, from a country that left the EU, this must be a hard question for you, but you want to say something about the expectations of the others to get into the EU?
Yes, yeah, it's a painful question. As somebody sitting in Britain, I mean, I agree with what all my fellow panelists have said, and I think, you know, I agree with Yevgen that we need to keep expectations high in order to have any chance of fulfilling them. I think one of the key issues from my perspective, not least because it was such an issue in relation to the UK and the European Union in the last decade, this touches on something that Jana said, which is about the need for effective communication. And I think there needs to be effective communication, not just you know, towards candidate countries, but also actually to the populations inside the EU and indeed I think also NATO as well, since I'm talking about security issues. I mean, I think one of the key areas of communication on security questions, something that needs to be made much clearer in debates around the future relationship between Ukraine and European institutions. One of the key points that needs to be made is that this is not a unidirectional process, right? This is not simply a process in which Ukraine benefits and the EU or indeed NATO is providing those benefits. Ukraine will bring important qualities and experiences to European institutions that it interacts with. Certainly on the security side, this is something that I've heard very frequently from security practitioners in member states, that actually, you know, Ukraine has invaluable experience from which we can only benefit. So I think we need to recognise that in order for any kind of further deepening of the relationship to be successful, there needs to be some expectation management, yes, for sure, but certainly a more effective communications process on the benefits that closer cooperation with Ukraine will be.
Thank you very much. And before I close the meeting, Mr. GAHLER, do you have a final thought for the audience?
Well, my final thought is that we should continue our support in general, but in particular also at short notice for the short term for the efforts that needs for them to win the war, and in parallel already start all the preparations that are foreseen in the Ukraine facility to get the preparations done and the people prepared, and our investors also interested and in parallel, let us also on the EU side use this momentum that enlargement is back on the agenda to do what needs to be done with regard to our own political leadership in this on this issue. It's not only for us in Brussels or Strasbourg to plea for enlargement, not only of Ukraine, but of the Western Balkans. It is about political leadership in the national capitals, in the democratic parties throughout Europe, to set this agenda and to speak of this geopolitical challenge that we face, of the need to avoid gray zones for the future and have a Europe united and free and peaceful and prosperous. And what we are doing now with regard to Ukraine is the best investment also in our common future. I look forward to continuing all this work with all those who are involved. So thank you very much for your efforts and for your presentation here today.
Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the close of this event. So I also thank all the participants to the project, all the experts. I thank the audience for listening and staying with us. This was the final event of a long process of more than a year to work together on the future of Ukraine and the EU. It was an example of what we call foresight or anticipatory governance. And I think it's important that we keep on doing this kind of projects, especially also on topics with so far-reaching effects like this one. So thank you all and have a great rest of the afternoon. If you want to read the report, you can find it online. Goodbye for now. All the best.